So I've inspected my tool in advance of plugging it into the wall. I'm going to go ahead and turn the unit on and turn it up to about 3/4 of the way till around 7. It doesn't take long at all for these pyrographic pens to heat up, and I'm just going to do a little test on the surface of my material. If I'm not seeing the kind of mark making that I want, then I'm going to crank it up a little bit more and then test it again. So now you can see I'm getting nice, clean lines on the surface. The longer I hold it in one place, the wider the line, right? So I can do hatching and cross hatching. I can do stippling by turning it up on point. And I can draw on the surface. And again, the longer you hold it in one place, the wider the mark will be. When it comes to wood burning, not all materials are created equal. So soft woods with long grain have a tendency to grab the nib and want it to follow the grain of the wood, especially when you're moving in parallel with that grain. The preferred materials from my perspective include birch and beech. These are particularly fine-grained materials that lend themselves towards being able to alliterate really clean lines on the surface of your material. Maple is also pretty good for wood burning, but my go-to is really Baltic birch plywood because the material is inherently stable, the grain is very closed and smooth, and it just really seems to lend itself towards being able to draw really fine lines on the surface of our material, right? Now, if you're trying to make straight lines in a piece of material, you can do that, but anytime that nib touches wood, it starts to draw some heat out of the end of that nib. When you put a metal ruler up alongside of it, that ruler is also acting as a heat sink and drawing some of the heat out of that tip as well. So you either need to slow your rate of travel or increase your energy output depending on what kind of results you're trying to get. So we saw that we can do hatching, cross hatching, stippling, lining up on a rule, and freehanding curvilinear shapes. Always make sure that when you walk away from a tool that's generating heat like this, that hot nib is stored appropriately. Here we've got a little mount on the top. Make sure that your cord is clear of that hot spot, that the unit is turned off. And if you're working in a space with other people, it's always prudent to unplug that tool so that it doesn't present a tripping hazard for others. Let's take a little bit of a look of working with paper. So there's substantially less heat required for working with paper. So I'm going to turn this guy down to about 3. And this is 100% cotton paper. So I'm going to do a little bit of a test. And I can see that I need some more energy input, so I'm going to bring it up to about 50%. Still no significant mark making on the surface. I'm going to crank it up a little bit more. There we go. Now, I can make smooth lines on the surface. I can gouge all the way through the material and perforate it. Or I can turn the tool down, or for simple lines, move faster to where I'm just barely coloring the paper. The tool can also be laid over on its side for mark and pattern making. Let's have a look at applications on leather. And again, it's so important that you understand that vegetable tanned leather, which we have here, is the only leather that is appropriate for burning. Too bad we don't have smell-o-vision right now. Woof. A good point about smell too is that if you smell something, it's usually a good sign to ask yourself, what is that smell? What is its source? Is it a potential risk factor? Now, carbon will build up on the tip of the nib, and the way to clean that is with a piece of felt. And we simply draw it across the surface on the felt, like so, and it cleans that nib right up. The cleaner the nib is, the cleaner the lines are that it makes. Soldering irons are exceptionally useful tools for wax work, for preparing your patterns for casting. So, but one of the big challenges is that most soldering irons have too much energy output to work well with wax. So the temperature is too high, so it tends to burn the wax, generating a lot of hazardous fumes. Because this microcrystalline wax is a petroleum product, you never want to expose yourself to the kind of fumes that are put out by heating that material up to excess. So one of the ways that we're able to control or moderate the energy input to that tool is by this little device that I've made here. And so this is nothing more than a metal box which is used by electricians to mount outlets onto. And that metal box has a grounded plug coming off of one side of it, a dimmer switch, which we're going to call a rheostat control, that the higher up it is, the brighter the light, or in the case of a soldering iron, the hotter the soldering iron, and then a couple of outlets mounted into the top here so that I can run a couple of tools. So I went ahead and made a mark on here at what is the energy input that I most commonly use for wax welding applications. And wax welding is very much like welding metal in that I need to make sure that my pieces are properly prepared in advance to make a good joint. So I've taken my wax sheet that I cast from a slab of microcrystalline, and I've cast those sheets of the appropriate thickness. And then I've taken a knife and I've beveled the edges of that material, creating a kind of V between the two pieces where I'm going to deposit my filler material. I also like to take a little piece of wax paper and put it underneath that joint so it doesn't stick to the surface that I'm working on. And then I have another small piece of wax that I've cut off that I'm going to use as my filler rod. So just like in welding, I want to establish a puddle on the surface of my work by melting that joint and then taking some filler and filling into that joint. So I'm going to dab that material in, and you can see that the going's a little bit slow here. So I'm going to go ahead and crank this up just a tiny bit. I'm trying to minimize the amount of smoke that's coming off of the surface. I come back in, establish my puddle, and then feed my filler material into that puddle. It might also be worth noting that you're able to modify the tip for whatever particular application you're working on. So I can flatten that tip, or I can make the tip pointed. And again, you see there's hardly any smoke coming off the surface of this, which is exactly what I want, because I don't want to be huffing any of the fumes that are coming off of the surface of that material. Once I've made my joint, then I can come back over the surface and I can feather, or this is sometimes called buttering, that down to smooth that surface out. And then I'll let that cool before I handle it. When it comes to sprue work, you'll also find this to be an exceptionally useful tool, because again, it allows us to make really sound joints between the components that we're joining together out of sprue stock. Because I can tell you that there's nothing more tragic than spruing your piece up and going into your slurry to get refractory on the surface of your material and then having one of those joints break. So again, to prepare that joint, I've taken a knife, I've beveled the edge of one of my pieces. I'm going to now stick those two pieces together and get a little heat put into the base of my material. I got a little crack here that I have to repair. This wax has been sitting around the studio for a while, so that joint was a little beat up. And I can nest that part in place. And now I'm going to work my way around that joint, infilling it. To bridge between those pieces. Until I work my way all the way around that piece.